The words hit Julia Dugan like a slap she had not seen coming, and she stood frozen in the middle of the dusty Caldwell Creek General Store, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though she could physically keep her heart from shattering through her ribs. "You apologize one more time for breathing the same air as the rest of us, Julia Dugan, and I will personally escort you out of this town myself," said Reverend Holt, his jowls trembling with the particular kind of rage that dressed itself up as righteousness. "You have overstayed your welcome by 6 months, a widow with no land, no livestock, no husband, and no intention of making yourself useful to this community." The whole store had gone quiet. Mrs. Pierce at the bolt of calico fabric, old Denny behind the counter with his hands frozen on the scale, 2 ranch hands near the door who had stopped pretending to examine harnesses, all of them watching, all of them waiting to see if Julia Dugan would crumple the way she always crumpled. She opened her mouth. The familiar words were right there, right at the tip of her tongue, worn smooth from years of use. "I am sorry," she would say. "I am so terribly sorry to be a burden. I will try to do better. I will make myself smaller. I will disappear a little more until I am nothing but a shadow pressed into a corner." And then the door to the general store swung open, and Warren Calloway walked in. She had never seen him before. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the Kansas sky right before a summer storm. That particular gray-green that meant something serious was on its way. He wore a trail-worn duster and carried himself like a man who had crossed enough difficult terrain that he had stopped being surprised by any of it. He took in the scene in one sweeping glance, and something in those storm-colored eyes sharpened. "Do not apologize for taking up space," he said, not loudly, not with any particular drama. He said it the way a man states a fact that has always been true and will always be true, looking directly at Julia Dugan as though she were the only person in the room worth addressing. "You have every right to stand exactly where you are standing." She had never heard that before. Not once. Not in 32 years of living. Not from her father, who had measured her worth against her older brother's ambitions. Not from her late husband, Thomas Dugan, who had brought her to Kansas Territory in 1878, and then had the spectacular misfortune of dying of a fever 6 months later, leaving her with a name that meant nothing, a roof that technically belonged to the bank, and a town full of people who considered a landless widow to be roughly equivalent to a stray cat, tolerated but never welcomed. Not a single person in her entire life had ever told her that she had a right to take up space. The room held its breath. Reverend Holt turned his considerable bulk toward this stranger with an expression that suggested he was about to deliver a sermon about the proper place of men who inserted themselves into matters that did not concern them. Warren Calloway did not appear particularly interested in the sermon. He walked to the counter, set down a list written on a folded piece of brown paper, and said to old Denny, "I will need provisions for 3 weeks. Pack enough for 2 people." He reached into the breast pocket of his duster and produced a coin purse that made a sound suggesting there was real money inside it. Then he looked at Julia again, and there was a question in those storm-colored eyes, and it was the strangest question she had ever been asked without words, because what it said was, "Are you all right?" and what it meant was, "I see you." That was how it started. That was the moment from which everything else unfolded, like a map that had been folded too long finally being pressed flat to show the full shape of the territory. But to understand why that moment mattered so completely, you had to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a Wednesday afternoon in late April of 1880, when Julia Dugan had been sitting in the back room of the Caldwell Creek laundry, ironing other people's shirts for 4 cents apiece, and trying very hard not to think about how she was going to pay the remainder of her rent to Mrs. Ochoa, who was a kind woman but who also had her own children to feed and could not carry Julia's debt indefinitely. Julia had come to Kansas Territory because Thomas had had a dream. Thomas had believed, with the magnificent confidence of a man who had never been told no, that the frontier was full of opportunity waiting to be seized by anyone bold enough to seize it. He had read pamphlets about it. He had corresponded with a land agent in Caldwell Creek who had promised him 160 acres under the Homestead Act and described the soil as rich and the prospects as limitless. Julia had packed her mother's good china, which was the one thing she owned that had any monetary value, and had followed Thomas west from Ohio the way she had always followed, 2 steps behind and quiet about it. Thomas had been wrong about several things. The land agent's letter had described acreage that turned out to be heavily mortgaged by a previous claimant whose paperwork was in dispute. The soil was decent, but not exceptional. The house was a sod structure that leaked magnificently during the spring rains. And the prospects, while not entirely non-existent, required a healthy adult man to pursue them, which Thomas ceased to be in November of 1878, when a fever he caught from a traveling merchant progressed from bad to catastrophic in the space of 4 days. Julia had buried him on the small rise behind the soddy with a wooden cross she had made herself, because there was no lumber to spare for anything more elaborate, and she had stood there in the thin November wind and felt something enormous and terrifying open up in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and was therefore the most shameful feeling she had ever experienced. Because here was the secret that Julia Dugan had kept locked in the furthest corner of herself for the 1.5 years since Thomas died. She had not loved him. She had been fond of him, in the way a person is fond of a familiar chair. She had appreciated that he was not cruel, which was a low bar that he had cleared without effort. But she had married him at 22 because her father had arranged it, and she had not known how to say no. And she had followed him to Kansas because she had not known how to say no. And she had spent 4 years of marriage being grateful that he was not worse, while quietly understanding that she had disappeared herself into his life so thoroughly that she was no longer sure she had one of her own. And then he had died, and the bank had explained with tremendous regret that the mortgage dispute meant the land reverted to them, and Julia had found herself in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, with her mother's china packed in straw, a small trunk of clothing, and precisely $11.40. Mrs. Ochoa had taken her in. Julia had found work at the laundry, and later at the bakery 2 mornings a week, and she had accumulated enough money to pay most of her rent most months and to eat without going hungry, which she considered a reasonable success given the circumstances. She had not considered herself a burden, exactly. But the town had considered her one, which amounted to the same thing. Caldwell Creek was a cattle town, growing in the particular frantic way of cattle towns in 1880, when the drovers came up from Texas along the Kisham Trail, and the money moved fast and loud through the saloons and the merchants and back out again. It was not a cruel town by the standards of the territory. It had a church and a school and a doctor who was only occasionally drunk and a sheriff named Burridge who maintained a cautious peace. But it had opinions about women, and its opinion about a widow with no land and no prospects was that she was a problem waiting to be someone else's, and until she became someone else's problem, she should have the decency to take up as little space as possible. Reverend Holt had appointed himself the voice of that opinion. He was not an evil man. Julia had thought about this carefully, because she had a tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt long past the point when the doubt had run out. He was a man who had small ideas about the natural order of things and large confidence in his own interpretation of that order, and in his interpretation, a woman without a husband was a disruption in the social fabric that needed to be corrected or at minimum contained. He had been making her feel like an inconvenience for 6 months. Small cuts, mostly, delivered in public, because public humiliation was more efficient than private conversations. Comments in the store. Comments after Sunday service. A word to Mrs. Ochoa about whether she was doing Julia any favors by enabling her dependents. A conversation with the bakery owner, Mr. Fenn, that had resulted in Julia losing her 2 morning shifts, which she could not prove was connected to the Reverend, but which had happened 3 days after she had overheard the Reverend telling Mr. Fenn that charity was best administered through proper church channels and not through the back door of a business. She had said nothing. She had apologized to Mr. Fenn for whatever inconvenience she had caused. She had apologized to Mrs. Ochoa for the delay in her rent. She had apologized her way through 6 months of being systematically squeezed out of a town that had never quite invited her in, and every apology had felt like handing away another small piece of herself until she was not sure what was left. And then Warren Calloway had walked into the Caldwell Creek General Store and said 5 words that rearranged something fundamental inside her. Do not apologize for taking up space. She had not apologized that day. She had stood very still in the middle of the general store while something warm and unfamiliar moved through her chest, and she had looked at this stranger with his storm-colored eyes and his trail-worn duster, and she had not apologized. Reverend Holt had left in a state of suppressed fury that Julia suspected would become a sermon by Sunday. Old Denny had started filling the order from the list. The 2 ranch hands had gone back to the harnesses. And Julia had stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, looking at Warren Calloway, who was in the process of selecting a tin of tobacco from the shelf and appeared to have already moved on from the interaction the way a man moves on from something that was simply the right thing to do. She had bought her salt and her cornmeal. She had left, but she had thought about those 5 words for the next 3 days with an intensity that surprised her. On the 4th day, the creek flooded. It was a spring flood, the kind that happened regularly enough that Caldwell Creek residents had a practiced efficiency about dealing with it, but it was worse than usual that year and it came fast. Julia's room at Mrs. Ochoa's was on the ground floor of a building that sat too close to the south bank of the creek, and at 2 o'clock on a Friday morning she woke to water coming under the door. She grabbed her mother's china first, then her trunk. She got both onto the bed before the water was deep enough to soak them, and then she stood on her bed in the dark, in 6 inches of muddy creek water, holding her lamp above her head, and tried to think calmly about what to do next. The solution to what to do next arrived in the form of Warren Calloway, who was passing her window at exactly that moment with a lantern and a rope, apparently in the process of helping the town manage the flood, and who saw her through the glass and stopped. He pulled her out through the window, not dramatically, not roughly, just efficiently, the way a man handles a situation that needs handling. He took the china from her and tucked it under one arm and offered her his other hand to climb through, and she took it, and his hand was large and warm and calloused and steady, and she climbed out into the ankle-deep water of the street with his hand firm around hers. "Your trunk," he said, "on the bed. I could not carry both." He did not say anything else. He handed her the china, went back through the window, and came out 2 minutes later with her trunk on his shoulder. She watched him do this and felt a disorienting mixture of gratitude and something that she could not immediately name. "Mrs. Ochoa has gone to her sister's house on the hill," she said. "I do not know where else to go." "The livery stable is dry," he said. "The owner is letting people sleep in the hay loft. Come on." She followed him through the flooded streets of Caldwell Creek at 2 in the morning, carrying her mother's china, following a stranger she had spoken to exactly once, and it was only when they were climbing the ladder to the hay loft, where 6 other displaced residents of Caldwell Creek were already arranged in the hay with blankets and lanterns, that she realized she had not apologized for requiring his assistance even once. That felt significant. His name, she learned that night, was Warren Calloway, and he was 34 years old, which was 2 years older than her. He was a rancher by trade, or had been, most recently in New Mexico Territory, and he had come to Caldwell Creek for a reason he described as complicated business that he was in the process of resolving. He told her these things in a low voice in the hay loft while the other displaced residents slept around them, and he asked her nothing about herself that felt intrusive, only how long she had been in Caldwell Creek and whether she had family elsewhere, And when she said she had a brother in Ohio who did not write, he nodded as though he understood exactly what that meant. She told him about Thomas. Not all of it, not the parts she kept locked away, but the outline of it. Married young, came west with him, he died, she stayed because she had nowhere to go back to. Why no place to go back to, he asked. My father's house does not feel like mine anymore. I think it stopped feeling like mine when I left it. She paused, surprised at herself for saying that much. I suppose I am not entirely sure where mine is. Warren was quiet for a moment. The lantern on the hay loft floor made everything amber and warm, and outside the creek ran high and fast with a sound like something that had broken loose. That is something a lot of people feel out here, he said finally. The territory has a way of collecting people who are between places. Is that what you are? She asked. Between places. He looked at her, and there was something careful and quiet in his eyes, like a door that was not yet open but was not locked either. Something like that, he said. She slept eventually in the hay, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of leather and summer, and she woke to pale spring morning light coming through the gaps in the livery stable walls. And Warren Calloway was already up and had gone out and come back with 2 tin cups of coffee from somewhere, and he handed her one when she sat up without ceremony. The way a person hands coffee to someone they have already decided is worth the gesture. She wrapped both hands around it and said, "Thank you." "Yes," he said. She nearly said, "I am sorry to trouble you." She felt the words right there, automatic, the grooved track they had worn in her. She did not say them. She drank her coffee instead, and the morning was thin and bright, and the creek sound had calmed, and something in Julia Dugan was quietly, permanently shifting. The flood damage to her room at Mrs. Ochoa's was significant enough that it was not habitable for at least 2 weeks. Mrs. Ochoa herself, returning from her sister's house on the hill with the specific exhausted practicality of a woman who had survived worse, looked at the mud on the floor and the water-stained walls and told Julia she was sorry and meant it. Julia needed a place to stay for 2 weeks with very little money. She had been calculating this reality with quiet intensity since that morning in the hay loft, because calculation was what she did when everything else felt unmanageable, and the numbers were not comfortable. The hotel on Main Street charged rates she could not cover for more than 3 nights. The church had a small room for charity cases, which Mrs. Frey, the Reverend's wife, had offered her twice before with an expression of such compressed pity that Julia would sooner sleep under the mercantile porch than accept it. There were 2 other boarding houses in Caldwell Creek, both full according to what old Denny said at the general store, which had become an informal community notice board since the flood. She was sitting on the edge of the livery stable watering trough in the afternoon sun, her trunk beside her, her mother's china in its wrapping on top of it, trying to think herself through an impossible arithmetic, when Warren Calloway sat down beside her. "You have that look," he said. "What look?" "Like you are solving a problem that does not have a solution." She looked at him sideways. He was eating an apple, the casual way people ate apples when they had nothing pressing to worry about, which was not her current situation. "My room is uninhabitable for 2 weeks," she said. "The alternatives are limited." He was quiet for a moment. He finished the apple and tossed the core and said, "I have a camp about 2 miles east of town. I came into Caldwell Creek for supplies and to deal with some legal business at the land office. I have been camping while the business gets sorted out." He said all of this looking at the street ahead of him, not at her, which she found oddly considerate, as though he was making the offer in a direction where she could decline it without feeling watched. "I have a second tent. It is your property to use or not use as you decide." She considered this. "That would not be appropriate," she said, "because it was 1880 and she was a widow and he was a single man, and those were the calculations that ran alongside all the other calculations, whether she wanted them to or not. It is 2 miles from town," he said. "Anyone who wants to make it their business will have to ride 2 miles each way to do it." She almost smiled. "Almost. You do not seem particularly concerned with what people think." I am concerned with what is practical, he said. And what is practical is that you have no place to sleep in 2 weeks that does not cost money you do not have. The tent is clean. I will be there, but I will not be in the same tent. You can have the one closer to the creek. The weather is warm enough. She sat with this for a long moment. The old reflex was to decline, to find another way, to make herself smaller and less inconvenient, to not take what was being offered. She sat with the reflex, and then she set it aside the way you set aside a tool that has stopped working. "All right," she said. "For 2 weeks." He nodded. Just nodded, as though she had made a perfectly reasonable decision, which she had. Warren Calloway's camp was on a bend of the creek east of town, where a stand of cottonwood trees provided shade, and the water ran clear, because it was upstream of the town's activity. He had a campfire ring made with deliberate stones, a canvas tent of good quality, and an organization about the space that spoke to a man who had spent considerable time outdoors and had opinions about doing it correctly. His horse, a gray roan named Temperance, was picketed on a long rope and appeared well-fed and even-tempered. He set up the second tent while she watched, efficiently and without fuss, and when it was done he showed her where the water was and where the food stores were, and told her to use whatever she needed. "You do not have to ask," he said, which she understood immediately as an extension of the same principle he had stated in the general store. They ate supper that first evening beside the campfire. Salt pork and cornbread she made in the cast iron pan that was part of his camp supplies. And he drank black coffee, and she drank the same, and they talked for 2 hours about everything, and nothing in the way that people talk when they are getting to know each other, and finding that the shape of another person is more interesting than they had expected. She found out that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer and his mother had been a teacher, that he had come west at 17 because Missouri in the years after the Civil War had been a difficult place to be young and poor and without clear prospects. He had worked cattle drives, 3 of them up from Texas, and had eventually saved enough to put a deposit on a small ranch in New Mexico territory, which he had worked for 5 years and which had been productive and something close to home, until a neighboring landowner named Garrett Hollies had decided that Warren's water rights were actually his, and had used a combination of legal pressure and hired intimidation to make Warren's position on that land untenable. He told her this without rage, which she found more telling than rage would have been. There was something underneath the calm, she thought, something that had been put away carefully but had not been destroyed. "Is that the business in Caldwell Creek?" she asked. "Hollies. Related," he said. Hollies had a partner in Kansas who was helping him manage the legal claims, land agent by the name of Prescott who operates out of Caldwell Creek. Julia's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "Prescott," she said. Warren looked at her. "You know him. He was the man who sold my husband the land claim that turned out to be in dispute," she said slowly. "The one the bank reclaimed after Thomas died." The firelight moved between them. Something passed across Warren's face that was complex and quiet. "Prescott has done this before," he said. "Sells disputed claims to settlers who do not know to check the underlying title. When the dispute surfaces, the bank or the original mortgagee reclaims the land. Prescott has already moved the money, and the settler is left with nothing." "Like me," Julia said. "Like you," Warren said. "Like at least 4 other families I know of in this territory." The anger that moved through her was clean and cold and nothing like the hot shame she usually felt about her situation. Thomas had not been foolish. He had been deceived. She had not failed to hold her marriage together in a hostile landscape. She had been placed in an impossible situation by a man who had stolen their chance at stability before they had even planted their first crop. "What are you going to do about it?" she said. "I have filed a complaint with the Federal Land Office," Warren said. "I have a lawyer in Wichita named Abrams who is gathering evidence. What I need is documentation of the other fraudulent claims and testimony from the people who were defrauded." He looked at her steadily. "Your claim against Thomas's estate would be part of that record," Julia set down her coffee cup. "You want my testimony, if you are willing to give it." She thought about this. She thought about Thomas's grave on the small rise with the wooden cross. She thought about $11.40 and 4 cents per shirt and Reverend Holt's expression in the general store. She thought about the word defrauded, which was a larger word than failed, which was the word she had been using inside herself for a year and a half. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Something shifted in Warren's expression then, something subtle and warm, and she found that she wanted to look at it more carefully, but did not know how to do that without it becoming something other than what it currently was, which was a practical conversation between two people with complementary problems. But she thought about his face by the fire that night for a long time before she fell asleep. The 2 weeks at the camp became 3 because there was a delay in the Wichita lawyer's correspondence, and because her room at Mrs. Ochoa's needed longer to dry out than expected, and Julia did not examine too closely how little she minded this. She had a pattern now, which was a thing she had not had in a long time. She woke early, in the blue pre-dawn when the cottonwoods were just silhouettes, and the creek made its constant sound, and she made coffee on the camp stove while the light came up. Warren was usually already awake, either tending temperance or reading, because he read more than she had expected, with a battered copy of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England that he was working through in preparation for his meetings with Abrams, and sometimes a thinner volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that he had apparently carried for years and was not self-conscious about at all. She borrowed it one afternoon and read half of it under a cottonwood tree, and thought about the way the poems kept insisting on the radical validity of existing, of the self, of the body occupying space in the world without apology. She handed it back to him and did not say anything about it, but she thought his eyes understood that she had recognized something in it. She went into Caldwell Creek most mornings to work her laundry shifts and do whatever small business needed doing, and she came back to the camp in the late afternoon and cooked supper, and sometimes they talked for hours, and sometimes they were quiet side by side in the way of people who are comfortable with each other's silence, which she had not known could happen so fast. He rode into town with her twice. Once to the land office to review the records she had found in Thomas's papers, which she had carried in her trunk all this time without knowing they would matter, and once, on a Thursday morning in mid-May, when he simply asked if he could ride in with her and she said yes without asking why, and they rode side by side on the main road with the morning flat and gold around them and the prairie smelling of late spring grass and the distant cattle operations, and he asked her about Ohio, and she told him. She told him more than she meant to. About her father's house in Columbus, which was comfortable and correct, and had felt like a waiting room for whatever her actual life was supposed to be. About her brother Marcus, who was practical and ambitious and had taken up all the space in their family without noticing that his doing so left no space for her. About how she had been the quiet one, the small one, the daughter who did not require management, which in retrospect she understood had meant the daughter who did not require attention, which had meant the daughter who had learned to need as little as possible from anyone. "He called you low maintenance," Warren said. Julia blinked. "My father never said that exactly." "What did he say?" "He said I was easy," she said, and then heard the word and felt the familiar flush of something that was too complicated to name. He meant it as a compliment. Easy to raise, easy to settle, easy to send west with a man she barely knew because she would not make a fuss about it. Warren did not say anything for a moment. His profile against the morning light was clean and serious. "You made yourself easy for other people," he said, "and it cost you your own life." She felt that sentence land in the center of her chest with a weight that was not comfortable but was absolutely true. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose it did." He turned to look at her then fully, which was harder to meet than she had expected because his eyes were doing that thing they did, that direct and unhurried seeing that treated her as though she were a landscape worth understanding rather than a problem to be managed. "What do you want, Julia?" he asked. "Not what is practical, Not what is possible. What do you actually want? No one had ever asked her that before either. The question sat in her chest next to the 5 words from the general store, and together, they were doing something to the architecture of how she understood herself, quietly dismantling walls she had not known were load-bearing until she felt the structure shifting. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I think I have wanted things I was not allowed to name for so long that I am not sure I remember what they are." "Then that is the work," he said. "Remembering." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the road ahead, and the morning spread out around them enormous and possible. And she thought that of all the things she might want, this, whatever this was becoming between them, was something she was not yet ready to say out loud but was very ready to feel. The legal situation moved faster than either of them expected once it started moving. Abrams, the Wichita lawyer, arrived in Caldwell Creek on the second Tuesday of June with a leather briefcase full of documentation and the focused energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly the right set of circumstances to make a case that would matter. He was small and precise and wore a good suit and shook Julia's hand briskly and said that her testimony and her documentation were exactly the evidence the federal land fraud complaint needed to become actionable. Prescott, whose land agency office was 3 buildings down from the general store on Main Street, did not know any of this was coming until it was already there. The federal marshal who arrived from Wichita on the Thursday morning was not dramatic about it. He walked into Prescott's office with Abrams and served the papers, and Prescott, who was a thin, gray-haired man with excellent manners and no conscience, tried twice to negotiate his way out of it and failed both times, because Abrams had anticipated every argument and had documentation that made them useless. Julia was in the land office across the street when Prescott was walked out of his building, and she watched through the window with her hands flat on the desk surface and something tremendous moving through her that was not quite satisfaction, but was related to it the way justice is related to peace. Warren was beside her. He had been beside her through all of it, the depositions and the paperwork and the meetings with Abrams where Julia had sat at a table and told the whole story for the record, starting with the letter Thomas had received and ending with the bank reclamation, her voice steady throughout, steadier than she had expected, because Warren was beside her, and because she was not apologizing for taking up space at that table. After Prescott was gone, they stood outside in the June afternoon, and Julia looked at Warren and said, "The land that Thomas bought, is there any possibility of reclaiming it?" "Abrams thinks the fraud judgment will void the subsequent mortgage claim," Warren said. "It will take time. The courts move slowly, but there is a case." "I do not want to go back to that land," she said. She said it clearly, testing the sentence, finding that it was true. "I did not want that life even when it was intact. I just did not know how to want something different." He looked at her with that steady, unhurried look. "What do you want instead?" She had been thinking about this for weeks. Ever since he had asked the question on the morning road, and she had said she did not know. She had been doing the remembering he had described, quietly, at night in her tent beside the creek, going back through years of herself and looking for the wants she had buried. She wanted to read. She had always wanted to read, more than she was allowed to, more than the practical women around her read. She wanted to write, which was an ambition she had never told anyone. She had been keeping a journal since she was 14, and she was a good writer, she thought. In the private way people know things about themselves that they have never had confirmed. She wanted land. Not for cattle, not for the kind of farming Thomas had envisioned. She wanted land the way a person wants room to breathe, space that was hers, where she could stand and not be in anyone's way by existing. And she wanted, though this was the hardest and the most recent, something that looked approximately like what was happening between her and Warren Calloway, which was the most terrifying want because it was the one she could least control and the one that would leave the biggest hole if it went wrong. "I want land," she said, "and I want a right." She paused and then took the particular kind of courage she was learning to take when it was needed. "And I think I want you." The afternoon light was long and golden on Main Street. The town moved around them, horses and wagons, and the clatter of the post-flood rebuilding that was still happening. A child ran past with a dog. Somewhere a hammer was working at a new board. Warren Calloway looked at her for a long, serious moment, and then something in his face opened, that door that had been closed but not locked, and it opened all the way. "Julia," he said very quietly, and the way he said her name was different from any way anyone had said it before. It said, "I see you." It said, "I have been hoping you would say that." It said, "You are not taking up too much space by wanting this. You are taking up exactly the right amount of space, which is all of it." He reached out and took her hand, right there on Main Street in Caldwell Creek in the June afternoon with everyone who cared to look able to see it, and held it with the same steady warmth as the night he had pulled her through the window in the flood. And she held his hand back and felt the last of something old and confining crack and fall away from her. Reverend Holt did, in fact, make it the subject of a Sunday sermon 3 days later. Julia sat in the second pew and listened to a 20-minute address on the subject of proper conduct and the dignity of widowhood that managed to be about her without saying her name once, and she sat through all 20 minutes with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she did not shrink even slightly. Mrs. Ochoa, sitting beside her, leaned over halfway through and whispered, "He has been this way since his own wife left him in '81. Take everything he says about women with an enormous amount of salt." Julia pressed her lips together to contain the smile. After the service, on the steps of the church, Warren was waiting for her with 2 horses saddled. He had attended the service, sitting at the back, and had heard every word, and his expression when she came down the steps was quiet and certain. "Ride with me," he said. They rode east, past the camp, past the bend in the creek, out into the wide prairie that rolled away from Caldwell Creek in every direction like an ocean that had decided to hold still. The June grass was tall, and the sky was the particular impossible blue that Kansas achieved in early summer, and the wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves that were not unlike breathing. Warren pulled up on a low rise, and they sat their horses and looked at the land spreading out below them. "This section here," he said, gesturing at the sweep of ground before them, "is part of the land Prescott's fraud case encompasses. Abrams says when the judgment is settled, there will be a reallotment of the disputed claims. Some of the settlers who were defrauded can file new homestead claims on portions of it." Julia looked at the land. It was good land. You could see water in the distance, a line of trees that meant another creek branch. The grass was healthy. It was not the land Thomas had dreamed of, or not exactly, but it was something she was looking at with her own eyes and her own wanting, and no one else's dream in the way. "How much is in the reallotment?" she said. "Enough for multiple claims, 160 acres each under the Act." She looked at him. "And you?" "I filed a complaint too," he said. "There is a section adjacent to the creek that would be viable for a modest cattle operation. 10-15 head to start. Nothing ambitious." "Nothing ambitious," she repeated, and she heard something in it that was an invitation, or at least an openness, a door held slightly ajar. She thought about what adjacent meant. She thought about 10 or 15 head of cattle and land that ran against other land, and what it would mean to work something together, to share a fence line, to wake up in the morning with someone whose tent was not 200 yards away, but just across a threshold you had both chosen to cross. "Warren," she said. "Julia." "I have never done this before," she said. "Said what I want before someone tells me what I should want. I am still learning how." "I know," he said. "You are doing it exactly right. What I want is this land," she said, "and I want to know what happens between you and me. I want to find out what we are, with time and space to find it properly, without any of the things that have been in the way." He held her gaze for a moment that was long and warm and full of something that did not need to be named yet to be real. "Then we file our claims," he said, "and we find out." She smiled, and it was the first smile in a long time that she had not measured for size or appropriateness before releasing it. It was a full smile, too wide and too obvious and completely her own. "Yes," she said, "we do." They rode back to town with the afternoon light behind them, and when they reached the outskirts of Caldwell Creek, Warren reached across the space between their horses and took her hand again, briefly, the way people do when they want to mark a moment as decided, and she squeezed his hand back, and the prairie held them both in its enormous golden light. The summer of 1880 was one of the longest summers Julia Dugan had ever lived, and also one of the best. The legal process moved with the grinding, interminable patience of federal paperwork, which was to say it moved slowly, but it moved. Prescott's case went to the federal district court in Wichita in July, and Abrams argued it with the compact precision of a man who had been waiting 3 years to make this argument. And the judgment came down in August in favor of the fraud complainants, which voided the subsequent mortgage claims and opened the homestead reallotment that Warren had described. In the interval, Julia stayed at Mrs. Ochoa's with a room that had dried out and been replastered, and she worked her laundry shifts, and she went to Warren's camp in the evenings, and they talked and ate and read and sat beside the creek in the late summer heat, and she found out what they were. What they were was this: two people who had both spent significant portions of their lives being smaller than they were, for different reasons, and who had found in each other an atmosphere in which it was safe to be the full size of themselves. Warren, she learned gradually, had a darkness in his past that was not a secret but was a weight. In his years on the cattle drives, when he was young and poor, and had not yet learned the patience that sat in him now, he had gotten into a bad situation with a man named Crawford, a trail boss who ran his drives with cruelty disguised as discipline. There had been a confrontation, and Warren had hit Crawford hard enough to break 2 of the man's ribs, and had spent 6 weeks in a Texas jail for it before a collection of other drovers testified to what Crawford had been doing that provoked the assault, and Warren was released. He told her this in August, sitting by the creek, carefully, as though testing whether it would change how she looked at him. It did not change how she looked at him. It told her something important about him, which was that the capacity for his patience had been earned through the understanding of what happened when it broke, and that he had spent 17 years since that jail cell building the self that could hold its ground without violence, and she thought that was one of the more honest and quietly heroic things she had heard about a person. She told him, in exchange, the thing she had kept most locked, that she had not loved Thomas and had felt guilty about this since his death, as though the appropriate response to someone dying was to retroactively generate the feelings that would have made the whole thing a tragedy rather than a mistake. Warren listened to this without judgment. "You were 22, he said, "and you were not given a choice." "I could have said no," she said, "to your father in 1874 in Ohio, as a young woman with no income and no legal standing separate from either her father or her future husband." He looked at her. "You could have said no the way a person says no when the alternative is sleeping in the street. You were not free to choose." Something cold and old loosened in her chest. "You are very direct about other people's rights," she said. "I have spent enough time having mine ignored," he said, "that I am attuned to it." She looked at him in the evening light and thought that she was very seriously falling in love with him, which was not what she had intended when she climbed out of a window in a flood at 2 in the morning, but which was happening with the inevitability of something that was simply right. The reallotment papers came through at the end of August. She filed her homestead claim on 160 acres that sat on the south branch of the creek, with a line of cottonwoods along the water and rolling grassland rising to the east. Warren filed on the adjacent section, and when they stood at the land office with their signed papers and looked at each other across the counter where old Jenkins, the land office clerk, was stamping documents with the methodical satisfaction of a man performing a sacred duty, Julia felt something so enormous and clean move through her that her eyes went bright with it. "Landowner," Warren said softly, just to her. She pressed her lips together and nodded, because she did not trust her voice with it yet. They rode out to the land together that afternoon, and walked it, which was something you did when land became yours, walked it to know it through the soles of your feet, to feel the ground and the grass and the particular way the wind moved across that specific piece of earth. She took off her boots at the creek and waded in up to her ankles, because the water was still warm from the summer, and she stood there with the cold and warm of it moving around her feet and looked up at the sky and thought, "This is mine." Not someone else's dream, not a place she had followed someone to, hers, claimed by her own hand on a document in her own name. Warren stood on the bank watching her, and when she looked at him, his expression was something she had not quite seen on him before, a softness that was careful and certain at once, and she thought, "You too," and she knew he knew it because his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile but was related to all the things a smile contained. They started building that fall. She could not afford a full-frame house, not yet, so she put up a good sod house first, better than the one Thomas had built, larger and more carefully constructed, because she had paid attention to what worked and what did not during her time in the territory, and she knew how to do it right. Warren helped, and 3 neighboring homesteaders she had gotten to know helped, and Mrs. Ochoa's 2 eldest sons helped for a day each, and the house went up in the particular communal way of frontier construction, with food shared and stories told, and hard work made lighter by the company. Warren's house went up on his section with the same community effort, and they helped each other, and there were evenings that fall when they stood at the fence line between their 2 properties in the last of the daylight and talked about what they were each planning, the kitchen garden she wanted, the small cattle herd he was starting, the writing desk she had ordered from the Wichita catalog with the specific seriousness of a person making a declaration about who they intend to be. In October, he kissed her for the first time. They were standing by her creek in the late afternoon, and she had been talking about a piece she had written and sent to the Wichita newspaper, a short essay about the experience of fraud and loss on the homestead frontier, which she had written under the name J. Dugan and sent without telling anyone, and which the newspaper had published the previous week, and which had generated 3 letters to the editor from other settlers who had experienced similar situations and felt seen for the first time. She had been reading him one of the letters, standing in the golden October light with the letter in her hands and her voice full of something complicated and bright, and she looked up and Warren was looking at her with an expression so open and certain and warm that she stopped speaking entirely. "Julia," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was not answering a question he had asked yet. She was answering the question he was about to ask, and they both knew it. He stepped toward her and took the letter gently from her hands and set it on the fence post, and then he put his hands on either side of her face, the way you hold something you understand to be important, and he kissed her, and it was nothing like anything she had experienced before, which was to say it was a kiss between 2 people who had both arrived at it fully, not by accident or duty or the absence of other options, but by choosing, clearly and entirely, to be exactly where they were. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with the same completeness, and the October light held them both, and somewhere across the fence-line temperance, the gray roan lifted her head and looked at them for a moment with the incurious benevolence of a horse that has seen humans do worse things. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it properly, which she had not expected from a man who was generally more interested in what was practical than in ceremony, but which she found moved her considerably more than she would have predicted. He had ridden into Caldwell Creek and spoken to no one except old Jenkins at the land office and the jeweler 3 doors down, and on a cold, clear November Sunday, he came to her door with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man who is not afraid, but who understands that what he is about to do matters. He said that he loved her first. He said it plainly, without preamble, standing in the doorway of her sod house with the frost-white prairie behind him and his horse tied at the post. He said that he had been in love with her for most of the summer but had waited because she had needed to find herself before she could find them, and he had known that and had been willing to wait as long as it took. Then he said that he was asking her to marry him not because she needed a husband, because she clearly did not. She had 160 acres and a published essay and a writing desk and a clear vision of her own life, but because he wanted to build something with her, not parallel to her, not in exchange for her assistance with his problems, but genuinely with her in the full meaning of that word. He produced the ring, which was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because turquoise was what the Wichita jeweler had had, and also because, Warren said, it was the color of the sky before the kind of weather that meant something was coming, and that had seemed right to him. Julia looked at the ring and looked at Warren and felt the full, clean, enormous yes moving through her like the flood, like the spring, like the first morning light through the cottonwoods. "Yes," she said. "Because I want to, not because I need to." He put the ring on her finger, and she put her arms around him and held on, standing in the doorway of her own house on her own land, and it was the most completely present she had ever been in her life. They married in December, in a small ceremony in Caldwell Creek, in the courthouse rather than the church, because Julia had a feeling about churches and the particular reverend who led the only one in town, and Warren thought the courthouse was more fitting anyway, two people formalizing a partnership before the law that governed them. Abrams came down from Wichita for it, and Mrs. Ochoa was there, and three of the Homesteader families they had become close to, and old Denny from the general store, who had witnessed the original scene that had started all of this, and who brought them a jar of his wife's preserved peaches as a wedding gift, which Julia thought was one of the most generous things she had received in a long time. Reverend Holt was not there. He had given no blessing and offered no remarks, and Julia had not asked for either, and the absence of his opinion felt like its own gift. They moved into Warren's house because it was slightly larger, and Julia kept her own sod house for a winter and spring, and then, when the winter proved that they were right to be married, and the spring proved it again, she converted it into the writing room and study she had always wanted, with her desk against the south window where the light came in all afternoon, and her bookshelves on the north wall, and a fire in the small iron stove, and absolute silence except for the creek and the wind. She wrote there every day that she could manage it, and she sent pieces to the Wichita newspaper and, increasingly, to papers in Kansas City and St. Louis, essays and reportage about frontier life written from the inside, by a woman who had lived it without the filter of distance or romanticism. The editor in Kansas City wrote back in the spring of 1881 asking if she would consider a monthly correspondence column, and she sat at her desk with his letter and understood that this was the life she had wanted without knowing she was allowed to want it. She wrote back and said yes. The cattle operation Warren had started with the small initial herd grew steadily that first year. He had a talent for it that was not glamorous, not the dramatic stuff of the cattle drives he had once worked, but a patient and knowledgeable husbandry that built a herd slowly and correctly. And by the summer of 1881, he had 20 head and a working relationship with 3 other ranchers in the district that made the operation viable. They fought, of course. Not badly and not often, but they were 2 people with strong views and real histories, and there were arguments about money, about risk, about the boundaries between her work and his, about the particular way Warren occasionally made decisions that affected both of them without consulting her because the habit of solitary decision-making was deep in him. These were honest arguments, conducted without cruelty, and afterward they were always better for having had them, which Julia came to understand was what argument was for between people who trusted each other. She told him once, after a sharp exchange about the money she had spent on additional books rather than the chicken coop repair that genuinely needed doing, "I am not going to apologize for wanting things." He had looked at her for a moment with something that was half exasperation and half profound satisfaction. "I know," he said. "I would never ask you to." "The chicken coop also needs fixing," she said. "It does," he agreed. "I will fix the chicken coop," she said, "and next month the book money comes from the household budget and does not require discussion." "Agreed," he said, and that was that. Their son was born in January of 1882. They named him Henry, after Warren's father, and he arrived in a cold, clear night with the prairie outside sparkling with frost, and Mrs. Ochoa, who had been a midwife before she had been a boarding house keeper, present and entirely in charge of the proceedings. Warren sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man doing his absolute best to be useful, and finding that the most useful thing he could do was stay put and not interfere, which he managed, just barely. Henry arrived healthy and loud and took immediately to the world with the particular ferocity of someone who intended to make his presence known. And when Julia held him in the lamplight, she thought that here was a person who had never apologized for taking up space and never would, and that this was precisely as it should be. Warren came in when Mrs. Ochoa gave him leave to, and sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at his son with an expression so naked and enormous that Julia felt it move through her like the turquoise sky before a storm. "Henry," he said, as though testing the name for weight. "Henry," Julia confirmed. He put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned against him, and Henry slept between them in the lamplight, and the January wind moved around the house and found no way in. Henry was a year and a half old when Garrett Hollies, the New Mexico landowner who had driven Warren off his ranch, made the mistake of traveling to Kansas on some other business, and was recognized in Caldwell Creek by a man named Santos who had worked for Warren in New Mexico and was now working a homestead 3 miles east of town. Santos came to Warren's place on a Tuesday morning with the news delivered with the tense economy of a man who understands the value of what he is carrying, and Warren listened and went very still in the way he went still when something needed managing, and Julia, who was nursing Henry at the kitchen table, watched his face and said, "What are you going to do?" "Talk to Abrams," Warren said. Hollies' land grab in New Mexico is a separate matter from the Prescott fraud, but Abrams has been building a case on it. If Hollies is here and accessible, there may be an opportunity to serve papers. "That is all," Julia said, watching him carefully. He met her eyes. There was something in his that was old and dark and being held very carefully. "That is all," he said. "There is nothing else to do." She understood that he was telling her not just what he would do, but what he had decided he would allow himself to do, and she understood the effort in that distinction, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "You are going to do this right." "I am going to do this right," he said, and squeezed her hand once. He sent a wire to Abrams in Wichita that day. Abrams arrived on Thursday. Hollies was served papers at the Drovers Hotel on Friday morning, and the subsequent legal process, while slow and bureaucratic and requiring 2 trips to Wichita and 6 months of correspondence, resulted in a judgment against Hollies the following spring that restored the New Mexico property to Warren's ownership as the original legitimate claimant. They did not go back to New Mexico. The land was there, and the judgment meant it could be sold, and Warren sold it to Santos and his wife for a fair price, which gave the couple land they had been working toward for years, and which gave Warren and Julia enough capital to build the proper frame house they had been planning on the Kansas property, larger and more permanent, with a 2nd bedroom and a real kitchen and a study for Julia that was integrated into the house rather than in the separate sod building. Julia kept the sod building anyway. She had made it into something, and she was not ready to unmake it just because there was a better option available. She put a lock on the door and called it hers, and continued to go there on mornings when the writing needed the particular quality of silence that a space entirely your own provides. The house went up in the spring of 1883, A frame house of white pine with a covered porch on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and a view of the creek from the kitchen window, and a proper chimney in the parlor that drew cleanly so the fire she kept all winter never filled the rooms with smoke. She planted a kitchen garden that summer, and a flower bed on the north side of the house that her neighbor Mrs. Hartley told her was foolish impracticality on the frontier, and which Julia planted anyway because she had earned the right to a flower bed. She was pregnant with their second child that summer, and she wrote through it, the Kansas City column and a longer piece about the homestead fraud case that Abrams thought might have a future as something more formal, a printed pamphlet or even a small book, because the federal land fraud issue was still active in the territory and the public record mattered. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1883, and they named her Clara, and she arrived with the same decisiveness as Henry, and immediately proved herself capable of making her brother entirely irrelevant when she had something to say about it, which was often. Henry was almost 2, and regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone who understands a territorial dispute may be developing. Warren taught Henry to sit a horse the following spring, which Henry approached with the same complete fearlessness with which he approached everything, and Julia watched from the porch with Clara on her hip, and thought about the years she had spent apologizing for her own presence, and felt the contrast with what she saw in front of her so sharply that it was almost a pain, except that it was the good kind, the kind that is the feeling of something that has been wrong being finally set right. There was a day in the late summer of 1884, 4 years from the morning Warren had walked into the Caldwell Creek General Store, when Julia was sitting on the covered porch with her writing materials, and the afternoon was long and gold, and the children were somewhere at the creek under Warren's supervision, and the prairie stretched out in every direction in the particular way it did in late August, full and warm and complete. She was working on what had become the pamphlet Abrams had suggested, which was now 40 pages of careful documentation and narrative about land fraud on the homestead frontier, and she was writing the introduction, and she was writing about herself, the woman who had arrived in Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1879 with $11.40 and the deep-grooved habit of making herself small. She wrote about what it meant to take up space. She wrote about what it meant to be told, by a world that had never offered her the instruction, that her presence was a disruption rather than a right. She wrote about the specific and grinding damage of being taught to apologize for existing, and she wrote about what it had taken to unlearn it, not all at once, not with a single dramatic declaration, but slowly, in the company of someone who had treated her presence as a given, and her wants as legitimate and her space in the world as non-negotiable. She wrote about 5 words spoken in a general store on a spring morning in 1880, and what they had meant, and what they had opened. Do not apologize for taking up space. She had never heard it before, and she had needed to hear it more than she had needed almost anything. And she thought about all the women like her, all the women who were being systematically compressed into corners by structures and men and customs, and the accumulated weight of being told they were too much or not enough or in the way. And she thought that if a pamphlet about land fraud could carry inside it also this other truth, the truth about what women were entitled to occupy in the world they lived in, then the pamphlet was more than one thing at once, which was the best kind of writing. She heard Warren coming up from the creek with the children, Henry's voice carrying the way small voices carry across open land, and she set down her pen and looked at the page for a moment before they arrived. She had 160 acres. She had a house she had made, and a study that was hers, and a flower bed on the north side that bloomed every summer. She had a son who was afraid of nothing, and a daughter who was afraid of even less. She had work that meant something and a voice that was being heard in Kansas City and St. Louis and increasingly beyond. She had Warren, who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. The screen door opened and Henry came through it at the particular speed that 4-year-old boys achieve when they have something important to report, which was approximately that of a small comet, and he said, "Mama, there was a crawdad in the creek and Papa let me catch it, and then we put it back because Papa said it had a family." And he said all of this in a single breath, taking up the entire porch and all the air in it with the magnificent entitlement of a child who has never been told that his presence is too much. Julia caught him as he reached her and pulled him into her lap and kissed the top of his head, which smelled of creek water and summer, and said, "Good." The crawdad needed to go home. Warren came through the door behind him with Clara on his shoulder, and Clara, who was not quite a year old and was in possession of the kind of focused determination that suggested she would be running the moment she had the coordination for it, was pulling at his shirt collar with complete authority. He sat down in the other chair and settled Clara against his chest and looked at Julia's pages on the table. "Introduction," he said. "Almost done," she said. He reached across and turned the top page toward him, reading a few lines, and she watched his face as he read. When he looked up, his eyes had that quality she loved most, that steady and open warmth that saw her completely. "Good," he said. "It is very good, Julia." She looked at him in the late afternoon light, on the porch of the house they had built on the land they had claimed on the frontier that had once seemed like a trap and had become a home, with Henry in her lap and Clara on his chest and the writing on the table between them, and she thought that this was it. This was the specific, detailed, actual life she had been living underneath all the wrong versions of it. "Warren," she said. "Julia." "Thank you," she said. "Not for any one thing, for all of it." He understood. She could see that he understood precisely. He reached across the space between their chairs and touched her hand, a brief and certain contact, the way he had done on the main road of Caldwell Creek 4 years ago when everything was still finding its shape. "You did this," he said quietly. "I just made some room." She laughed, which startled Henry off her lap and made Clara laugh in the generalized way of babies who join laughing without knowing why. And Warren smiled, his full smile, the one he did not give easily, but which when it came was the whole of him, and the prairie evening held them all in its gold. The pamphlet was published in Wichita in the fall of 1884, under the title Fraudulent Claims, a record of land agency misconduct in the Kansas and New Mexico territories, by Dugan Calloway, and it was distributed through the federal land offices and reprinted twice that year. Abrams used it as supporting material in 2 subsequent cases, and a senator from Kansas referenced it in a congressional discussion about land fraud enforcement that Julia read about in the Kansas City paper the following spring and had to sit down for. She had not expected the pamphlet to travel that far. She had written it to be true and useful, and it had been both, and the truth and usefulness had carried it further than she had planned, which was the nature of honest work done carefully. Henry started school in Caldwell Creek in the fall of 1885, walking the 2 miles to town with a lunch pail and the complete confidence of a child who had been raised to believe his presence was a right and not a question. His teacher, Miss Aldridge, who was 23 and had come from Topeka, and was one of the better educated people currently in Caldwell Creek, sent home a note at the end of the first month saying that Henry was bright and forthright, and had strong opinions about fairness, which she meant as a mild cautionary note, and which Julia and Warren read as a straightforward compliment. The cattle operation had grown to 40 head by 1885, and Warren had taken on a full-time hand, a young man named Elliott from Missouri who was careful and conscientious, and learning the work with the same patience Warren had built it with. The ranch was not large by the standards of some of the operations in the territory, but it was sound and it was theirs, and it supported the family without drama. Julia's column in the Kansas City paper continued, and she had developed a reputation in the region as a frontier correspondent whose work was notable for its combination of practical reportage and clear moral analysis. She received letters from readers, from women especially, who wrote to say that reading her felt like hearing something they had known but never had language for, and these letters she kept in a wooden box on her writing desk, tied with kitchen twine, because they were the truest measure of whether the work was doing what it needed to do. In the spring of 1886, she discovered she was expecting again. She told Warren on a March morning before the children were up, sitting at the kitchen table with the first coffee of the day, and he put his cup down and looked at her with that open expression, and then he reached across and covered both her hands with his. "How are you feeling?" he said, which was the question, not the congratulation, because he understood that the question came first. "Good," she said. "Tired, but good." She smiled at him, a little terrified. "Reasonable," he said. "Warren, Julia, I want to keep writing," she said, "all the way through. I stopped too much with Clara, and I do not want to do that again." "You will keep writing," he said. "We will manage everything else." "Elliot can take more of the cattle work," she said. "Elliot has been waiting to take more of the cattle work," Warren said, with the faint humor that lived at the edges of his serious face. "I think he finds my supervision excessive." She laughed. "Your supervision is thorough." "It is the same thing," he said. Their third child, another boy, arrived in November of 1886, and they named him James after no one in particular, because it was a strong name and it suited him. He was quieter than Henry from the start, a watching child, with Warren's gray-green eyes and a quality of attention that Julia recognized because she had had it herself and had learned to call it observant rather than withdrawn. He would be the reader of the three, she thought, when she looked at him in his first weeks. He would need bookshelves more than pasture. Henry, who was now 6, received James with the seriousness of a boy who understood that a new brother was a new jurisdiction to negotiate. Clara, 3 years old and entirely in charge of the household, in every way she could manage, regarded James as her personal project and spent considerable time explaining the world to him in a voice of tremendous authority. The house was full. Julia sat at the kitchen table on a December morning with James sleeping in the cradle beside her, and the older two at their morning tasks, and Warren's boots on the porch outside, and the fire in the stove and the writing desk visible through the open door of the parlor where she had moved it for the winter to stay warm, and she thought about the word full. She had been so empty for so long. Not dramatically, not in a way that had ever expressed itself as crisis, but in the quiet, pervasive way of a person who has been systematically taught to give away more than they keep, until what is left does not fill the space inside themselves. She had been an outline of a person, present and functional but somehow not entirely inhabited. She was inhabited now, completely and without apology. She reached for her journal, which she had kept since she was 14 and which now occupied 12 volumes in the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, and she wrote a single sentence at the top of the page for that morning. "I know what I want. I know that I am allowed to want it. I know how to ask for it and how to receive it and how to give it back. And this is the thing I spent the first 30 years of my life not knowing, and it is everything." She closed the journal and picked up James, who had woken with the particular focused hunger of newborns, and settled him, and looked out the kitchen window at the Kansas winter outside, the snow lying flat and white on the prairie, the line of cottonwoods along the creek black and bare against the sky, the fence line between her land and the land that was also hers running clean and true across the white. Warren came in from the cold with snow on his shoulders and stamped his boots at the door and came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and James blinked up at them both with the ancient, unworried gaze of a very new person, and outside the snow came down steady and quiet on the 160 acres that were Julia Dugan Calloway's, on the land she had claimed with her own hand, on the frontier that had once looked like a dead end, and had turned out to be the exact place where her real life had been waiting. Caldwell Creek held a community social that winter, the first Friday in December, in the new community hall that had been built the previous spring, and Julia and Warren went with Henry and Clara, leaving James with Mrs. Ochoa, who had become a fixed and beloved constant in their lives, and the hall was warm with lantern light and fiddle music, and the assembled families of the district in their best clothes. Reverend Holt was there. He was older now, and slightly smaller, as men who were mostly made of argument tended to become when the argument stopped producing results. He had delivered no sermons about Julia in years, which she attributed partly to the fact that she had stopped being available to diminish, and partly to the fact that she had published enough that diminishing her would require more effort than he had available. He crossed the room toward her at some point in the evening, with the particular deliberateness of a man who has been working himself up to something, and she turned to face him and stood her ground completely, all 160 acres of her, all 3 children and all 12 journal volumes and all 40 column pieces and the pamphlet and the Kansas City correspondence and Warren's hand at the small of her back. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. He had not called her that before. He had been calling her Mrs. Dugan since her marriage, in the particular way of people who do not acknowledge what they cannot control. "I have been told," he said, and he said it with the constrained expression of a man swallowing something unpleasant, "that your writing on the land fraud matter was read into the Congressional Record." "It was," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something complicated moving behind his eyes, and then he said stiffly, "That is a significant accomplishment." Julia looked at him, and she thought about the man he had been and the woman she had been and the general store on that spring morning and everything that had come after it, and she said, evenly and without malice, "Yes, it is." And then she turned back to her husband and her children and the music, and she danced, right there in the middle of the community hall in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in December of 1886. With Warren's arm around her and Henry pulling at her hand to join, and Clara already spinning on her own in the particular 3-year-old way of a child, who does not yet know that the world might want her to be smaller. And Julia Dugan Calloway danced and took up every inch of the space she was in, and did not apologize for a single moment of it. She never would again. The years that followed settled into the shape of a life that was recognizably, completely, specifically hers. Henry grew into a serious and fair-minded young man who had his father's patience and his mother's precision with language, and he took an interest in law, which surprised no one who had spent any time with him, and which Abrams, who visited occasionally when his legal circuit brought him near Caldwell Creek, encouraged by sending books and asking Henry questions that expected real answers. Clara grew into a force of nature who had decided opinions about horses, mathematics, and the inadequacy of the educational options currently available to women on the Kansas frontier, and who spent considerable energy lobbying her mother to write something about this for the Kansas City paper, which Julia eventually did, and which generated more letters than anything she had written previously. The particular letters of women who were tired of being told that their ambitions were inappropriate to their gender and their location. James grew into the quiet, watching reader she had predicted from his first weeks, with his father's gray-green eyes and an inner life of impressive depth. And he was the child who came to Julia's writing room most often and sat in the corner reading while she worked, and did not need anything from her except to be in the same room, which she understood entirely because she had been that child herself, and she made sure he always knew the room was open to him. In 1889, Kansas became the 38th state, and Julia wrote about it in a long column that attempted to hold both the genuine celebration and the complicated history in the same frame, the beauty and the violence of the frontier's making, the promise of the land and the people it had chewed up in delivering on that promise. And it was one of the best pieces she ever wrote. And when Warren read it, he held it for a long time and then looked at her with that open, complete regard and said simply, "Yes, that is the truth of it." She had 4 pieces in the Kansas City paper that year. She was not famous. She had no illusion of that, but she was read, and being read was the particular intimacy of writing that she had wanted since she was a girl writing in her journal in her father's house in Columbus, Ohio, and it never stopped mattering. Their land was fully producing by the early 1890s. Warren's cattle herd had reached 60 head. Elliot had become a full partner in the operation, and the ranch made enough to keep the family comfortably without the precariousness that had characterized their first years. Julia's writing income had grown to something that she thought of as genuinely hers, not supplemental to the household economy, but her own earned contribution to it. Money she had made by being exactly what she was and saying exactly what she thought. She bought 3 new bookshelves for the study in 1891 and filled them with novels and collections and a complete set of Encyclopedia Britannica that cost more than she had spent on anything since the writing desk, and which she felt no need to justify to anyone, including herself. She and Warren had an evening that winter, one of the winter evenings when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and they sat by the fire in the parlor with their respective books, and the comfortable silence they had built over 11 years of marriage. And she looked across at him in the firelight, this man who had walked into the Caldwell Creek General Store on a spring morning in 1880 and said something that had rearranged her life. And she thought about how strange and exact the way that things happened could be. He looked up from his book, as he sometimes did when she was thinking about him, as though her attention had a weight he could feel. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking about the general store." He knew immediately what she meant. He always knew. "Holt," he said. "You," she said. "What you said." He looked at her for a moment with that open, warm regard. "Do you know," he said, "I almost did not say it." She blinked. "What?" "I almost did not say it," he repeated. "I walked in and I saw what was happening and I thought, this is not your business, Calloway. These are strangers and this town does not know you and you have legal problems to deal with, and the last thing you need is to make an enemy of the local reverend." He turned a page of his book absently, without reading it. "And then I looked at you," he said, "and you had your hand on your chest and your mouth was already opening to apologize, and I thought, no, someone needs to say the other thing before she says it." Julia felt something move through her that was sharp and warm and very slightly ridiculous. "You almost kept walking," she said. "I very nearly kept walking," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I am very glad you did not keep walking," she said. He looked back at her, across the parlor of the house they had built on the land they had claimed, in the life they had made together from 5 words spoken on a spring morning, and his expression was everything that it had always been, complete and certain and hers. "I am very glad I did not keep walking," he said. Outside, the Kansas winter was doing what Kansas winter did, the wind moving over the flat white land in long cold sweeps, and inside the fire was warm and the children were sleeping and the bookshelves were full, and the writing desk held tomorrow's work waiting, and Julia Dugan Calloway, who had once apologized for breathing, who had once made herself so small she nearly disappeared entirely, sat in the full and certain occupation of her own life, taking up every inch of the space that was hers, and did not apologize for a single word of it.